Of the Weidenbaum Center here at Washington University. And if you are not familiar with us, at the Weidenbaum Center, we support rigorous social science research, and just as importantly, we are committed to bringing that work into meaningful public dialogue. So our mission is to serve as a bridge, connecting scholars and policymakers and students and community members, and connecting them on issues that matter most. So today's program is just a perfect example of that mission in action, and we are so pleased to present it as part of the Campus Consortium partnership between the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting and the Weidenbaum Center. So today we are honored to welcome journalist and author Karen Howe, whose new book, Empire of AI, Dreams and Nightmares in Sam Altman's OpenAI, is a chilling and deeply reported investigation into the power and consequences of artificial intelligence. In her book, Karen pulls back the veil on the industry driving one of the most consequential technologies of our time. She exposes the layers of environmental harm, labor exploitation, and the concentration of data and narrative control. So as we grapple with the ethical and political challenges of AI, her reporting is shocking, but it also brings clarity and caution. So before we begin, just a quick note. Karen and I are going to chat, and then we will leave ample time for questions from you all. There are microphones to my right and to my left, and I will let you know when it's time to start lining up. And again, I promise I will leave time for everybody. So I'll introduce Karen now, and then we can begin. Karen Howe is a best-selling author and award-winning technology journalist whose work sits at the intersection of AI, power, and accountability. She was the first journalist to profile OpenAI, and her 2025 book, Empire of AI, is a New York Times bestseller. Her writing appears in The Atlantic, and she leads the Pulitzer Center's AI Spotlight series, which trains journalists around the world to cover AI critically. Before this, she was a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and a senior AI editor at the MIT Technology Review. She received her degree in mechanical engineering from MIT. Please join me in welcoming Karen Howe.
Thank you all.
So Karen, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So exciting. So the book is absolutely fascinating and
Thank you.
Just so well reported. So I just wanted to first kind of level set with the audience. So my first question is actually for you all. If you have ever used ChatGPT in any way, from menu planning or doing your homework or writing a business email or having an image or outlining a difficult conversation with your mother-in-law or to helping write your wedding vows, would you please raise your hand? Okay, wow, I should have asked who has not used AI. Okay, or ChatGPT rather. Okay, so Karen, there's obviously familiarity with ChatGPT, but I actually think we should start with the definition of what artificial intelligence is. You talk in the book about it being the shape-shifting and that amorphous aspect of it. That's really fascinating. So can you just talk about what is AI and AGI?
Yes, great question. Thank you all so much for being here this afternoon with me. So this is always actually the hardest question to answer because AI is actually a really ill-defined concept. Many people think that AI is just ChatGPT or ChatGPT is all of AI because that is how the public was ultimately introduced to this technology, but AI is actually a collection of so many different types of technologies. And I sometimes use the analogy that the word AI is like the word transportation, and that there's a lot of different types of transportation. We could be talking about everything from bicycles to rockets, but all of these different types of transportations have different design intentions, different purposes, and different cost-benefit trade-offs. And AI is kind of the same way. The collection of technologies are loosely tied together in that they all try to mimic different human capabilities, but ultimately their utility, how much it costs to build them, the type of data that is used to train them varies widely. And artificial general intelligence is this kind of new term that OpenAI popularized when it first was co-founded in 2015. And it really tries to go back to actually the original definition of AI when AI was first coined. AI is actually a really old term from 1956. And at that time, it was this new discipline that was attempting to recreate human intelligence in computers. Now we kind of use AI colloquially to just refer to products and services that these companies provide us that seem to have some of these human capabilities. But AGI has become the new term to refer to that human level intelligence. And it's a theoretical notion. We do not actually scientifically know whether it's possible to recreate human intelligence in computers, but it is the thing that Silicon Valley has made its singular goal at this point. All of the effort that these AI companies are engaged in is in an attempt, or so they say, to get to AGI. And what I talk about in my book is ultimately this is an endeavor that we should be extremely critical of, because ultimately, under the banner of trying to reach AGI, essentially, the companies have just found the perfect cover for consolidating an extraordinary amount of unprecedented economic and political power, unprecedented land, energy, water, data resources, and are undermining many pillars of democracy.
Thank you. That leads perfectly to my next question, actually. So obviously, the title of your book is Empire of AI. And I found the metaphor of empire so apt. You write in the book, the empires of AI are not engaged in the same overt violence and brutality that mark this history, but they too seize and extract precious resources to feed their vision of artificial intelligence, the work of artists and writers, the data of countless individuals posting about their experiences and observations online, the land, energy, and water required to house and run massive data centers and supercomputers. So too did the new empires exploit the labor of people globally. And then you later add, OpenAI is now leading our acceleration towards this modern day colonial world order. So as we start there, let's first talk about the resource extraction and the plundering of natural resources like water, land, and air. Can you just tell us some of the energy requirements and water requirements of data centers?
Yeah, so to kind of contextualize, I mentioned we have all of these different types of AI technologies, but Silicon Valley's particular conception of AI is these large-scale models that are trained on as much English language data that they can find on the internet, and these massive, massive supercomputers. And to just give a sense of how crazy it is that we've reached this point today, just a few years ago, AI models were trained on maybe one computer chip or single-digit number of computer chips, and at most a couple hundred computer chips. And now we are talking about a single AI model being trained by tens of thousands of computer chips or hundreds of thousands of computer chips. And OpenAI and Meta have both made plans to build supercomputers the size of Manhattan that draw on the power demand of Manhattan to train future generations of systems. And so McKinsey came out with a report earlier this year showing that based on the pace at which the AI industry wants to push, we would need to add as much energy to the grid as what is consumed by 2 states of California in a conservative scenario, and in an accelerated scenario, 6 states of California. And California is the 5th largest economy in the world. So this is an insane amount of energy, and people have pointed out to me before, but wait a minute, the modern internet is also based on data centers, social media is also based on data centers. Yes, we have had global expansion of data centers for a while, but the AI industry's global expansion of data centers is completely at a different level. So whereas before, US energy demand roughly flatlined over the last decade, even as we were expanding data centers, because it was roughly at the pace that matched increases in data center efficiencies as well. We are now seeing a historic rise in energy demand in the US and all around the world to a degree that is, I think, is not going to be able to be supported by the planet. Most of this energy is coming from fossil fuel sources. So we've seen the revitalization of the coal and natural gas industries almost single-handedly by all of this AI development. And there's also a fresh water element to these data centers as well, because they have to be cooled with fresh water. They can't be cooled with any other kind of water due to it being corrosive to the equipment or leading to bacterial growth. And so Bloomberg recently had an investigation earlier this year that found that 2/3 of the AI data centers are entering water scarce areas. So there are communities around the world that are competing with this silicon infrastructure for life-sustaining resources.
It doesn't end there though, right? So there's also the plundering and exploitation of human labor, and that some of the most haunting passages in the book are about that. So can you tell us a little bit about who's doing this invisible work behind AI?
Yeah, one of the myths that Silicon Valley really perpetuates is that AI is somehow this magical technology that can just learn how to do everything itself. But actually, everything that an AI model can do is ultimately shown it by humans. And for example, the fact that ChatGPT can chat is because thousands of people around the world showed this AI model examples of what it means to engage in dialogue. Here are two humans talking. One person talks, the other person talks. One person asks a question, the other person gives an answer. And it's only through this kind of repetitive example showing that the AI model starts to develop the same pattern matching and then be able to regurgitate those patterns in a persuasive way. The other thing that people don't really often recognize is that AI models also often need to engage in content moderation. This is specifically only true of Silicon Valley's approach to AI development because they are scraping the entirety of the internet to try and train these models. And the internet is a big and dark place with a lot of grotesque corners. And so there's a lot of gunk that gets poured into these models. And because these companies are operating at a data quantity that is so vast, they do not manually audit what is put into the models. They just use some automated mechanisms to try and filter things, but it's imperfect. And so what OpenAI did when it started deciding that it wanted to commercialize GPT models and put it in the hands of many more users around the world, they realized they needed to build a content moderation filter so that if the model ever started generating grotesque things based on that training data, it would be blocked, or there would be one more mechanism to block that content from reaching the users. And for my book, I ended up going to Kenya to meet the workers that OpenAI contracted to build that content moderation filter. And what that meant for the workers was they were reading through reams and reams of the worst content on the internet, as well as AI-generated content where OpenAI was prompting its own models to imagine the worst content on the internet. And then the workers had to put it in a detailed taxonomy of harm. Is this hate speech, harassment, sexual content, violent content? What degree of severity? Is the violent content extremely graphic? Is the sexual content involving child abuse? And they ended up suffering the same kind of traumas that the social media era content moderators suffered, where they were deeply psychologically devastated. Many of them were unable to fully function for years after this work. And some of them had their families fall apart because when you as an individual break down and there are people who rely on you, that is also traumatizing to them as well.
And working for little to no wage, and in one case,
less than $2 an hour.
Yeah, and 22 hours a day in one case.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn now to Sam Altman. So as you know, and I think as many of us know, he's from St. Louis and went to Burroughs. So the book opens with the dramatic firing and then almost immediate rehiring of Sam Altman by the board of directors in November of 2023. And one of the reasons that the board gave for firing him was that he, quote, was not consistently candid in his communications with the board, end quote, and they didn't have confidence in his ability to lead the company. So despite the board's reversal of their decision, your book details multiple examples of him not being candid, and one could even argue deceitful in his communications with the board and with his employees and sometimes with his family and certainly the public in examples like you're giving. So what do you think the board saw that the rest of us didn't? And then I guess my second question is, why do you think that so many people, after seeing these patterns of behavior, continue to trust him?
Yeah, this was one of the hardest things to report for the book because when the board crisis happened, all this stuff was floating around about, should we be believing the board's assessment that he's not consistently candid? How do you even assess whether or not someone's consistently candid? I would ask different people who had worked with him. I interview over 250 people for the book and over 90 OpenAI current and former employees and executives. And in the beginning, when I would just ask them, like, do you think he's consistently candid? Some people would say yes, and some people would say no. And I was like, this is getting me nowhere. And so I started asking people instead, what did Sam tell you in this meeting at this point in the company about what you were doing and why? And because I interviewed so many people, I was able to ask this question to groups at each stage of the company. And that's when I started realizing that he would tell different people different things based on what he believed was sort of the thing that that would motivate them to ultimately go in the direction that he wanted them to go. And so the board, I think there were two things that were happening that led to the board's decision. One was this, the fact that they had realized over time that he was not giving people a single truth, a single source of truth at a company that is ultimately doing something quite consequential. And so what was happening was different teams were operating on different baselines of information, and they would get really competitive and kind of backstabby with each other because they all thought they had the backing of the CEO to kind of do what they needed to do, and they were the top priority at the company, but every single team was kind of being told this, and so there was just a breakdown of a lot of communication, a lot of trust, a lot of coordination. But the other thing that was going on is the board is, one of the things that also surprised me reporting the book is that there are essentially quasi-religious movements that have developed within Silicon Valley about what the stakes of AI development really are. There are people at this company and there are people in the broader AI industry that believe that they are ultimately building something akin to an AI god, and that when they achieve this kind of AI god, it is going to be cataclysmically transformative for civilization, and that if they do not build it correctly, if there's just even one small mistake along the way, it could instead turn into an AI demon. And so the board was of this kind of adjacent to this ideology where they really felt like the stakes of OpenAI going well or not going well was potentially the difference between humanity going to AI heaven versus going to AI hell. And that made the fact that Altman was not consistently candid particularly alarming, because they thought, if he is not building a sound decision-making environment within the company, what kind of mistakes might be made that will have potentially cataclysmically negative consequences on the world? And so that was ultimately that led them to fire him, but then of course they made a pretty egregious strategic error, which was they couldn't actually explain their decision to employees or to the public or to investors. But the second part of your question, which is like, why do people still appear to trust him? I think one of the things that Altman is really good at doing, first, he has a incredible understanding of human psychology, and he can continue to motivate people based on what he thinks is sort of their deep desire, and he's ultimately a billionaire, so he's able to offer a lot of people different things based on what he thinks will help them continue moving forward. The other thing that he's really good at is he's able to position himself in ways where he is the conduit for people to access certain types of resources or capital or financial wealth. So with investors, he is kind of the main person that is giving them all these promises that we will get you a return on your investment. With employees, he's the main person that is helping raise extraordinary amounts of money so that their stock options continue going up, and they're continuing to be able to liquidate those stock options into millions of dollars of cash. And I think that is and many employees also see this quest that they're on to try and build artificial general intelligence as a very expensive one, and so they also see him as uniquely qualified as someone who's very good at fundraising to continue leading the company and get to those milestones that they want. So it's like, are there people that trust him emotionally? Yes, but many people also follow him, not necessarily because of an emotional trust, but because of his capabilities in getting people what they need and want.
Now, I'm just going to acknowledge that this next question is sensitive. So you had extraordinary access to Sam's sister, Annie. She has made extremely serious allegations against Sam, including accusations of incest, and I want to be clear that he's denied those. I think every person here can understand that every family is unhappy in its own way. Truth is elusive, and truth might not even exist, right, in complex family dynamics. However, you were exposed to particularly sensitive family dynamics and an unbelievable amount of information that she gave you. And so what did you learn about the Altman family? And then when you got up close and personal, I'm just wondering if you saw anything that helped explain the patterns behind Sam's drive for control or the way he manages his power.
Yeah, so for people that are unfamiliar with the Altman family, Sam is the oldest of 4 kids. He has 2 brothers under him and then a younger sister 9 years younger than him. And the 2 brothers took a career path very similar to him. So all 3 brothers ended up in the tech world. They all became investors. They all became extremely financially successful. And Annie was the black sheep of the family. She was the artsy-fartsy kid, also more interested in science and academia. And so she never had any interest in going to the tech industry. She actually really wanted to be like a stand-up comedian or be a writer or be an artist. And their family dynamics were always a little bit troubled, in part because I learned that the Altman parents, Sam's parents, they did not have a very happy marriage. So he did not have sort of a fully idyllic, peaceful childhood. He was often playing mediator as the oldest child between his 2 parents and trying to resolve their conflicts. And of course, then like all of the siblings also had various different personalities and tensions and idiosyncrasies that they had to kind of like manage as they were growing up as well. And so I think the biggest thing that I learned really was when you're talking, like typically when I'm talking to people about Altman, they know him as a leader or as an executive or as a professional. Whereas when I was talking with Annie, like she's just saying like my brother this, my brother that, you know, and it suddenly struck me that, you know, he's just a human like any other human. And one of the critiques that I have of him is not actually personal to him. It's more that no human is perfect. Everyone brings about a certain set of complexities and baggage, and they're situated in all of these really complicated relationships. And then if that person is given an extraordinary amount of power to make decisions that affect billions of people, there's just things that are going to go wrong, whether it's because they have blind spots, because their lived experience just does not encompass the full breadth of all of the lived experiences of people in the world, or whether because of like more malintent or whatever. But you cannot expect any individual, it doesn't matter if it's Altman or someone else, like even if you were to swap someone in for his current position, I still don't think it would be a sound arrangement. It's just structurally fragile to have a single person be making all of these intense decisions. And so in Sam Altman's case in particular, I realized that, you know, he is under an extraordinary amount of not just corporate pressure and industry pressure, but personal pressure. He's dealing with a lot of different dynamics. And it was really clear that in Annie's case, like this was a thing that really deeply affected him, affected his decision-making at the company, affected the way that executives thought about him as well and whether or not he was trustworthy. And so in general, if we want to create more sound AI governance, like we need to be moving away from this single failure point type of structure to a much more robust, democratic, participatory structure where many people can kind of be involved in critical decisions that affect so many people around the world.
This is my last Sam Altman question, and then we're going to move on from him. So you open the book with a quote from him in 2013 that says, in part, "The most successful founders do not set out to create companies. They are on a mission to create something closer to a religion. And at some point, it turns out that forming a company is the easiest way to do so." So religion typically hinges on a belief system. Do you think Sam Altman knows what he believes?
Ooh, does he know what he believes? I don't think he does.
I don't think so.
Yeah. I think a lot of the tech tycoons of our age believe that they believe certain things. Like, basically what I'm saying is that they're self-delusional. Like, they have a story that they tell themselves about what their beliefs and their values are. But then, you know, when they're operating in the world, they make decisions based on the very complicated intersecting conflicts of interest that they have to negotiate. And whether they're able to retain what they think are their values in that process is honestly really unclear. And I think this is true of Altman. And this has become particularly true, I think, in the way that he is engaged with the Trump administration. Like, he was a longtime vocal Democrat who would fundraise for Democratic candidates, who would really espouse Democratic values. He also tried to run for California governor at one point, which was a detail that had been rumored for a long time, but I was able to confirm in the book. And he ran on, or he started developing a Democratic platform in order to his run. And then you see when Trump comes into power, like, the first thing that he starts tweeting about is, I regret that I didn't look more closely at this man Trump and realize how great of a leader he was. And I no longer have a political home. I don't think I'm a Democrat anymore. And when you look at things like that, you're like, okay, so do you really know what you're doing? Like, do you really have a core value and then you're suspending it because you have to do business in the world? Or are you also getting carried away by that and kind of losing touch with your original values? And I think a lot of people who know Altman, they also feel a little bit unsettled because they're not 100% sure which one it is.
So this leads kind of perfectly into my next question, so somewhat famously, OpenAI began as a nonprofit. And it was meant to democratize artificial intelligence, to make sure it benefited and protected humanity. But today, of course, it's one of the most powerful and secretive companies in the world. And it also has an evolving governance structure, including a for-profit entity. So was this always the plan? Or what is, if not, like, if Sam just didn't quite know what he believed, then what does this evolution tell us about the power structure in the tech world?
Yeah, I don't think that it was always the plan, but I do think that looking at the evolution of OpenAI, you can see that maybe the plan wasn't literally a bespoke nonprofit with a for-profit nested in it, but I do think Altman didn't have high convictions of retaining OpenAI as a nonprofit. I didn't ever find some kind of document or smoking gun that suggested this. It's just that understanding him as a character, he's extremely strategic. And as I mentioned, he's really good at sort of figuring out how to get people what they need and also get to the next step of a particular endeavor. And when you look at what OpenAI needed when it was first founded, it was co-founded by him and Elon Musk as a challenge to Google. They wanted to become the dominant AI player as a nonprofit instead of Google being a for-profit, or so they said. And the main bottleneck at the time was talent. They needed to figure out how to attract talented graduates coming out of PhD programs, as well as poach talented researchers who already worked at Google. And they couldn't compete on salaries, but they could compete on mission. And being a nonprofit was the best way to show their commitment to that mission. So
It gets back to religion, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So at the time when the bottleneck was talent, it made sense to make OpenAI nonprofit. But then they successfully got all of the talent, and then it became, the bottleneck shifted. The bottleneck turned into capital, because OpenAI made the decision that if we're going to beat Google, we need to build larger supercomputers than Google. That is a very cash-intensive endeavor. And so that's when it made sense to create a for-profit, because now the bottleneck is raising money. And so you can see kind of like, Altman, I don't think he even back then was sort of charting out, 10 years in advance, I'm going to do this and then do this and then do this. But you can see how he was sort of just like, what do I need in this exact moment to pull together all of the pieces to get to the next stage? Once I've gotten to the next stage, we can scrap everything we did before and now reorchestrate a new kind of scenario to get to the next stage. And so all the way to present day, we're now in discussions where OpenAI is like, let's just get rid of the nonprofit governance altogether. Let's just be a for-profit. And that's because at this point, the bottleneck is more capital than anyone has ever tried to raise before, and the nonprofit is getting in the way.
So one of the things that kind of struck me in the book is that this idea that AI is supposed to be the answer to societal problems, like it is going to solve climate change, it is going to solve our healthcare mess. But we all know, like AI is not perfect, and there are hallucinations. Lawyers have submitted briefs with completely fake and invented cases, which were generated by AI. And I would argue more urgently, like a few months ago, sitting HHS Secretary RFK Jr. submitted the Make America Healthy Again report. It was produced by the White House. It had clearly used AI. The report contained fake citations, invented studies, and then false and misleading information. And this strikes me as particularly dangerous since it involves science and also our health, and that our leaders are relying on this. So in thinking about this misinformation, or maybe even comparing it to past technology, like what makes AI so uniquely dangerous to our democracy? And then how do we think about accountability in this brave new world?
Yeah.
Solve our problems, Karen.
There are so many reasons why the Silicon Valley's conception of AI challenges democracy. I mean, first and foremost, it is allowing them to become more powerful than nation states as companies. And when I was reporting the book and meeting with all of these different communities, whether it was the workers in Kenya or there were activists in Chile that I was talking to, or residents in Arizona who were also dealing with data centers, or teachers, students, whoever it was, every single person that first encountered the empire of AI felt the same feeling, which is, I have no more agency to self-determine my future. How can I possibly have agency when my labor is being exploited and I'm being paid less than $2 an hour? How can I possibly have agency when my fresh water is being taken, when we literally do not have, and I talk about this community in Montevideo, Uruguay, where there was literally not enough fresh water, so the government was mixing salt water into people's taps, and women were having higher rates of miscarriages because for those who couldn't afford bottled water, that's what they were drinking. And it's like, how can I have agency when I can't even have my basic necessities guaranteed? But then, and so I realized, like, if the majority of the world starts to feel that way, starts to feel like they don't have agency to participate in collectively shaping their own lives or shaping the collective future, then democracy doesn't work anymore, because that's literally the entire premise of democracy, is that we all feel like we can actually change our futures and we have a say in our futures. But also now, like, since the book has come out, another huge challenge of AI to democracy is the blurring of truth and and fiction. And there is so much, like, these systems are being integrated as a backbone of so many different information systems now that it really has gotten significantly harder to parse what is real and what is fake online. We're also seeing these tools, these companies start making these tools more and more addictive. I think very much because they've spent so much money building this technology and it's not actually taking as well as they thought it would with businesses. So now they're trying to harvest more data to then do advertising and create like a freemium model on users, and that's leading to all of these extraordinary mental health challenges, especially among teenagers, and leading to another pillar of democracy being challenged, which is social cohesion, like people being in community with one another, being able to trust one another, being healthy, holistic human beings that can actually participate in this collective governance project. And so there are, yeah, like all of the, it is really hard for me to see any of the promises that Silicon Valley has made play out, but I do already see so much evidence around us of exactly the opposite happening, like them eroding every institution, every pillar of ultimately what allows us to have good lives.
I want to ask more of a positive question since we've been a little bit negative. So something that you've talked about is task specific versus generative AI. Can you please just define that for us and then help us understand why this is a better option?
Yeah, so going back to the fact that AI is a collection of various different technologies, I would say that you could say that large scale generative, general purpose models like ChatGPT, they're kind of like the rocket of AI, in that there's probably a very limited set of things that we actually need rockets for, and it would not actually make sense to give everyone a rocket or tell everyone to use a rocket for everything. Like if you were trying to commute from the suburbs of St. Louis to here, like, I mean, like with a rocket, it's not fit for purpose. And so for me, the thing that we need more investment in is alternatives, like the bicycle of AI, basically. And these are the small task-specific AI systems that I really advocate for. This is things like DeepMind's AlphaFold, which is an example of a system that DeepMind, a London-based firm, developed before they also went into the large language model race. And this system is able to very accurately predict how a protein will fold based on its amino acid sequence, which is a key step to understanding human disease, to accelerating drug discovery. And it won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry last year. And this is a system that it was not trained on the internet, so it was just trained on amino acid sequence data and protein folding data. So it did not need content moderation, which meant there was no labor exploitation involved in the development of the system. It did not need vast supercomputers because the data set is way smaller and highly curated. It was actually just trained on maybe a couple hundred computer chips, don't quote me on that, but significantly smaller resources, and ultimately has these like really concrete, profound benefits to society. And another example is there's this nonprofit called Climate Change AI. That's a group of all these top AI researchers around the world documenting and cataloging all of the different problems related to climate mitigation that they think can actually use AI to kind of get leverage into. And these are things that are basically like computational problems, because ultimately AI is an advanced computational technology. That's what it's good at for. It's good at solving computational problems. Things like better weather prediction for extreme weather events so that there's more resiliency in disaster response, integrating more renewable energy into the grid, better material science so we can get more interesting energy storage solutions, optimizing supply chains, reducing the energy demand of buildings. Like all of these are different problems that they've documented as the AI could
could make a dent in this. And then they list all of the types of AI technologies that could be doing that dent making, and none of them have anything to do with large-scale models. They're all small and task-specific, and they all have the same kind of features as AlphaFold, which is they're trained on curated data sets, small data sets, not on supercomputers, and they do not involve labor exploitation. And so to me, like, that is the promise of what we want out of AI or any technology. We look at all the problems that we have in society. We want better healthcare, better education, clean air, clean water, more democracy. And then we should be thinking about how do we design specific targeted solutions to advance each of these things. And there are some things that AI will be really good at helping us advance, and there are other things that it will not. But the just like mind-boggling situation of our present circumstances is that we are not investing in those types of targeted solutions. We're just pouring all of the money and all of our environmental, social, labor capital, intellectual capital into these large-scale models that are leading to a lot of detrimental consequences.
I'm going to ask Karen my last question here. So while I'm asking and she's answering, please go ahead and line up if you have any question for her. We have a microphone over here and over there, and we would love to answer as many questions as possible. So Karen, about 20 miles from here in St. Charles, there was a proposed 440-acre data center project, and it was withdrawn after a major community backlash over secrecy and transparency, water use, energy use. And now, similarly, like here in St. Louis, there's a similar project that was proposed at the Armory site, and the energy usage would have been equivalent to the same energy usage in 13,000 homes, which is as many homes in Shaw, Tower Grove South, and Tower Grove East combined. So it was proposed, but now it's facing delays due to environmental concerns, growing public opposition. There have been executive orders from our mayor's office, et cetera. So St. Louis is working hard to brand itself as a hub for tech and innovation. But now we've taken a stand by pushing back against these major data center projects. So you are speaking to a group of people who live in this area, and help us, give us some tips. What role should we be playing in these conversations? What questions should we be asking? And then more broadly, how can we, you answered this a little bit in the last question, how can we push for tech development that serves the public good, right? Rather than draining our resources. Yeah. But first, I'd really like to dive into the St. Louis stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I really believe we need just in general is more what I call bottoms-up governance of the AI industry, because one of the challenges right now in our political environment is there's not a lot of top-down governance happening from the government. The Trump administration is not interested in actually holding Silicon Valley accountable, and in all respects is actually trying to supercharge Silicon Valley's unfettered access to resources, unfettered access to labor. And there are some efforts at the state level that are making their way through state congresses, but ultimately, I think the biggest mechanism that we have is collective action where communities will voice what they want out of this technology and what they will allow to stand. So I think it's incredible that so many people in the greater St. Louis area have been activated and have been asking the right questions to their city council about these data center projects and are pushing back on these data center projects when they do not think that it serves the community. And like ultimately, like it's not about, I'm not saying like we should all just be anti-data center and we should all just ban data centers. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying like we need to make sure that these companies are accountable to communities, to the people that they impact. And so they need to provide an arrangement. If they want to host a data center in a community, they better provide an arrangement that works for that community. And it's amazing when it doesn't work that everyone is sort of pushing back and demanding that there be some kind of better proposal or better regulation at the government, at the local government level to make sure that these projects are reined in and ultimately do become beneficial. And I think, I would just say, keep doing what you're doing. I don't have any tips beyond what's already been happening here. Yeah.
Do you want to mention Josh?
Yeah, and I guess the other thing is, in addition to
the local activity that you can do, of course, you also elect representatives that then represent you in the federal government. And I actually think that Senator Josh Hawley has done some really, really interesting work at the federal level of holding these companies accountable as well. I don't endorse all of his positions on everything, but he did recently propose a bill, I think it's called the AI Leads Act, where he's basically trying to open up the federal courts to allow victims of AI companies to sue the companies. Right now, victims have to rely on a patchwork of state laws in order to sue these companies. And if this were passed, like talking with civil society leaders about this bill, they think it would actually be a really huge accountability mechanism. Companies will be more scared about being held liable for the harms to different individuals. And so, yeah, at the local level, continue asking questions, showing up, protesting when you do not like what you see, and continue electing people at the federal level that are willing to hold these companies accountable.
Thank you. Steve, why don't we start with you, and then Chris, we'll go to you. And I don't know if that's on, but there's
Hello?
an easy flip.
Yeah.
Oh, no, it's on.
Sounds like it is. First of all, Karen, thank you so much for your book. I really enjoyed it and was
Thank you.
fascinated to read it. And it kind of read both on the level of like a fascinating sort of insider story of corporate governance, fighting and figuring out how leadership is going to work in a tumultuous, fast-moving environment. Aside from the AI dimension, it's just fascinating, the insider story, and also the model of thinking about AI as sort of a colonial venture of taking knowledge and work without payment, and the environmental issues. All that was opened my eyes to lots of things. I have a question about something a little different. In the spectrum of boomers and doomers, right? The folks that are going all out for AI development as fast as we can, and I guess right now we would say OpenAI and Sam Altman are kind of in that boomer camp big time. The doomers are, Eliezer Yudkowsky, and this is going to kill us all. And it's aside from the environmental, the unethical, the actual technology and how it plays out is of grave risk to humanity. And as it progresses, we don't even know how it works. We don't know, we can't explain how this works, and we're not developing it, we're growing it. So I'm just interested, to what degree do you give merit to the doomers who think, aside from all the harms that you've identified, the technology itself, as it grows and advances, is a serious or even existential threat?
Yeah, great question. I am very critical of the doomer ideology because it places agency in the AI system. So that camp of people are saying that the problem is ultimately that AI could go rogue and ultimately cause things like killing everyone. And to me, that shifts responsibility away from the people who develop this technology and the people who use this technology, and it also shifts attention away from the people that are affected by the technology. And many of these doomer types, like Eliezer Yudkowsky, they do suggest, if you actually believed that AI would kill everyone, there's literally no other harm that rises to that level. And so they deprioritize all of the other harms that I talk about. They deprioritize the environmental harms, the labor harms, the social harms, because they're like, it doesn't matter if we're all gonna die in maybe 2 years. And I just don't think that's a productive discussion, because it is not grounded in any scientific evidence. And the companies, the more boomer companies, are then able to leverage this narrative to create this continue creating this veneer of AI is so powerful that only a small group of people deserve to control it, or should be controlling it, or that's the safest possible approach to development. So basically they contribute actually to the power consolidation that is happening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Karen. Thank you for being here today and also answering all of our questions. Elizabeth, you stole my question on the Armory situation downtown, but I appreciate you giving your thoughts on that. I want to ask, can you give a little bit more details for the audience on a lot of the task-oriented models that are out there, as I'm sure a lot of people, they focused on like the big ones, OpenAI, ChatGPT, Gemini, Copilot, list goes on and on. Can you talk a little bit more about how we as a audience could get more involved in supporting those models? And kind of going along with that same question, it seems like anytime AI happens, or any sort of AI innovations, those things, it seems like communities that are disadvantaged are always at the short end of the stick. How do we make sure that disadvantaged communities are short end of the stick, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So one of the organizations that I really love that I also talk about in the book is DARE. It stands for Distributed AI Research Institute. That's founded by and led by Dr. Timnit Gebru, who originally was the ethical AI team lead at Google before she was fired, if people followed that news at that time. But her organization is in part all about trying to design these more task-specific systems in ways that are grounded with the communities that are ultimately meant to benefit from these systems. And so she, like all of the researchers at her institute, they will identify specific problems by first going into the community and kind of talking with the community about what are the challenges that face them, and then through that process identifying whether there are leverage points where AI can actually be part of the solution. And then they work with the community to gather that data, to train the models, to deploy the models, to figure out what kind of applications might be user-friendly enough to actually work in the community. So I think that's kind of the model that I imagine for developing these more small task-specific systems, is that it needs to be, like St. Louis has a wonderful university here with a lot of computer science talent and AI research talent, and also social science talent and all of the other kind of expertise that is required in AI development, and having community members and academics be partnering with one another to identify what are all of the unique things in St. Louis or in Missouri that we could use leverage AI to solve, and then kind of do community-based workshops, create an initiative where there's checkpoints in collectively developing these AI systems. I think that would be an amazing, amazing model to innovate on and
Can I just
replicate.
add the anecdote at the end of the book about the dead language, reviving dead languages?
Yeah.
I mean, if you just want to, that was so inspiring. And I
Yeah.
was so excited. Why don't you just tell that story?
Yeah, so in the epilogue, I talk about one of the stories that very much along the same vein that really inspired me and continues to inspire me about a different way of developing AI. And it's about this group called Tahiku Media, which is a nonprofit Maori media organization in New Zealand. And they wanted to participate in trying to revitalize the Maori language because, like many indigenous peoples around the world, the Maori almost lost their language due to colonization policies that instituted that they could not learn their language, they had to learn English. And Tahiku Media is unique in that they're a Maori radio station that all of their interviews are done in Te Reo Maori, in the language. And so they had 30 years of rich archival audio of people speaking this language, and they wanted to open that up as a community resource for anyone who was trying to reclaim their language, learn Te Reo Maori, to be able to hear the sounds of their ancestors speaking it in kind of an uncorrupted form before English started distorting the vowels and the accent. And the biggest challenge that they faced was in order to make this resource actually accessible, they wanted to transcribe it so that when people are listening, they can see the words as well, and then they can click on the words and get a definition of the word. They can also see how it shows up, how the word is used in other archival audio. And that meant the transcribing factor. They just did not have enough speakers of Te Reo Maori to transcribe that much audio. This became a perfect use case of developing a bespoke, task-specific speech recognition tool for Te Reo Maori. And so what they did was, first and foremost, they went to the community to ask, do you want this AI tool to exist? And it was only when the community gave their consent that they then moved on to the next step, which was, okay, now we need to collect the data for training this AI system. So they launched an AI literacy program to teach people about why they would need the data in the first place, and then they had this community competition where people could voluntarily and consensually donate their data, basically audio of them saying different words in Te Reo Maori with the transcription attached to it, and then submit it through this online portal. And because it was such a community-wide effort where everyone was bought into this project, within I think less than a week's time, they basically got all of the data that they needed from the community. It was maybe a couple hundred hours of audio, which is a tiny, tiny data set compared to these colossal models. But it was sufficient because it was a curated data set targeted at the task that this AI model was meant to perform. And then they trained the model and went back to the community and said, how do we develop applications to now make this model useful to you? And they finally created a license so that if anyone ever wants to access the data set that now exists, they have to get permission from the community, and they have to sign legally binding documents to say that they will never use the data in a way that harms the community. And so at every stage of the AI development and deployment process, they were going step by step with the community, making sure there were multiple checkpoints, multiple processes in which there was collective governance. So that's kind of like the model that I was trying to describe that I imagine some place like St. Louis could replicate and continue to innovate.
Gotcha. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm thinking a lot about technology and inequality and the social benefits and the social costs. And I feel like in this talk you've mentioned communities that have had AI and the harms of AI imposed on them, like the groups in Kenya. Elizabeth, you've talked about resistance in the case of St. Charles, but then I'm thinking about organizations that invite AI in, and I think maybe aren't thinking about the costs as they're looking at the benefits. And one type of organization is the university. So I'm thinking about, for example, San Jose State, and their new move is, AI everywhere. And certainly as I walk around WashU's campus, I see AI everywhere. My students email me using AI. They refine their papers using AI. We have all kinds of talks about AI. I'm curious about what you would tell universities in this moment as they enthusiastically embrace this new technology. What do you think are some of the costs they're not considering?
I think the first thing that I would say to universities, but to any organization, is first remember what your original purpose is, and AI, however you use AI, should be in service of that. And I think sometimes with any technology revolution, people start to forget. They think, all technology is just good and we should just adopt whatever technology comes along the way. But that then puts the technology first and not the people and not the purpose. And so universities are beautiful educational institutions that should be engaged in education. And if AI ultimately is undermining that project, then there's a question about whether we should be using it. And so I think it kind of goes back to this collective governance thing. In order to figure out at each university level what is ultimately the right stance to take on AI, which AI systems should you adopt, which ones should you not adopt, where should you be adopting them or not adopting them, it needs to be a collective decision. I see a lot of institutions right now, because they're just freaked out, doing a top-down decision of we will just go all in on AI. They never consulted any of the students, any of the professors, any of the other community members, and that needs to change. There should be a broader discussion within the university community about what is actually, are there actually beneficial uses of this technology? Let's map out all the different ways that we might be able to continue using these tools to fortify education, and let's map out all the ways that it could undermine it so that we put some guardrails around those particular uses. And maybe after this exercise, you'll find that there are a much more limited set of uses than originally you thought, or maybe you find that it's better to actually invest in more bespoke task-specific systems than adopting these wholesale. I think the other thing that I guess I would warn against is like within journalism, we're seeing a lot of things that I'm sure universities relate to, where media organizations are just partnering with companies by saying, yes, you can have all of our data. I sometimes write for The Atlantic. The Atlantic has struck a partnership with OpenAI. It has made me a lot less excited to write for The Atlantic because now OpenAI legally can just train on any article that I write for The Atlantic. And what I tell media organizations is like, you're ultimately ceding an extraordinary amount of power to an organization that is already way more powerful than you, and you actually are entering such an imbalanced relationship that you think you might be getting a foothold into the conversation or a seat at the table. No, like they call the shots. They can decide ultimately what to do with your data and when to exit the partnership. And you literally, what can you possibly do to change their mind? You can't, because they are so powerful, they're so cash resourced, like they can literally turn around and partner with any other organization. And so I would say the same thing to universities is like, be really cautious, not just in like figuring out what your AI adoption policy is, but specifically with entering these types of partnerships that give these companies free rein to certain types of spaces, certain types of data from your institutions, because once they've satisfied their thirst, they're going to leave and exit the partnership, and now they have it all, and what did you actually get in return?
This will be our last question.
Karen Howe, thank you so much for this incredible work that you've done. It's such a public service, and I think it gives a lot of people hope that they can finally understand the issues surrounding AI. I drove all the way here from Kansas City, and they are planning on 12 data centers in Kansas City. And they've already made all the promises about, oh yeah, we'll give you jobs and we'll do all these things in the community. And considering that there's going to be a 10-year moratorium on regulation of AI, what can be done to compensate people for the extreme extractive nature of AI, from the theft of intellectual property, to surveillance capitalism, to the workers in Kenya that monitor all of this? What can be done, considering that there's not going to be any regulation for 10 years, to compensate people for the use of their data that they're giving without their consent or compensation, as well as their intellectual property? Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for coming from Kansas City. The good news is the 10-year moratorium was scrapped, so it's not passing. And this was actually a remarkable moment in, I don't know that people notice this. I think it was 99 out of 100 senators voted against having that specific moratorium in once they realized that it was in there. There were a couple senators that admitted that they signed it originally, not even realizing that that specific clause was in there. So that's the good news, is we don't have that moratorium. But who's to say if it might be introduced again or in different forms? So we definitely need to be vigilant about that. Going back to what I was saying about collective action and bottoms-up governance, I take a lot of inspiration from Rebecca Solnit's work and the way that she thinks about movement building and how to ultimately challenge extreme power. And she recently put out this resource, or I guess earlier this year put out this resource called the Resist List, where it just asks this simple question, like, what can I do to challenge authoritarianism? And then she listed all of these different actions that you can take as an individual or as a group to challenge the pillars that prop up authoritarianism in this country. And that's the way that I've started thinking about what we need to do to hold these companies accountable. There are pillars that prop up their activities. They actually need an extraordinary amount of access to resources that we collectively own. That data that they scrape is actually ours. That land that they're trying to take to build those data centers, the energy, the water, is actually ours. And we've seen a lot of success with when communities actually assert their ownership over those resources and apply pressure to a key pillar that props up the industry, the AI industry's activities start to falter. So artists and writers and creators that are suing the companies and saying, this is our intellectual property, that is them asserting ownership over the data pillar. All of the data center, all of the communities that are resisting around the country for data center development, that is them applying pressure to the data center pillar. There are workers that are organizing both within the AI industry as well as in many different industries that are challenging the ability of these companies to just exploit the labor or just adopt AI, to, like the Hollywood artists and writer strikes. That's another that's challenging the pillar of adoption. Like, these companies can't create sustainable businesses if people just stop adopting these tools, or if they adopt only the tools 50% of the time. And so that's kind of how I think about it. And when I was like working on the book, I was in a really dark place. Like, I did not have a lot of hope. But you know, I read Rebecca Solnit's Hope in the Dark, which is this amazing book. It's very, very short. If people haven't read it yet, I would strongly encourage you to do. And it's all about like the beauty of movement building and why building these collective movements are ultimately the most resilient way to change things, even though it sometimes feels the most slow or the most excruciating. But she also talks about why ultimately, like what hope ultimately is. And she says, hope is not pretending that things are okay or were okay or will be okay. Hope is recognizing that there is so much destruction in the world, and yet there is also a lot of uncertainty. And in that space of uncertainty is the room to influence and to act. And so the job of every single one of us is to act and make sure that every action that we take is ultimately taking steps forward towards a better future, towards resisting the empires, towards building up our agency and fortifying our democracy. And I cannot think of a better way to put it than Solnit.
I started the AI book club because of you and your work.
Thank you so much.
That was a good way to end. I want to thank you for being here, Karen. This has been an honor. Thank you all for being here with us today. There are copies of Karen's book outside around the corner, courtesy of Left. Please join us at all of our events. They're listed on the back of your program. They're also on our website. I'd like to especially thank Alana Baim, as always, for her endless help in getting this event off the ground today. I'd also like to warmly thank Ann Peters and Emily Pulitzer for being with us today. The Weidenbaum Center's partnership with the Pulitzer Center is one that we are deeply proud of, and it's an honor having you here, Emmy. So thank you for being here. So please join us outside. I need a glass of wine after this, and so that's where I'm headed. And Karen's going to stick around to chat, sign some books. Please join us. And thank you again for being here, and join me in thanking Karen one more time.
Thank you so much all for being here.